A profound enigma is currently revealing itself in the depths of space. We have assigned this enigma a designation. We refer to it as 3I Atlas. However, this designation does not indicate that we truly comprehend what it is or what its purpose might be. 3I Atlas exhibits peculiar characteristics. Its appearance is peculiar. Its movement patterns are peculiar. Its composition is peculiar. Despite all the time we have dedicated to examining this object, fresh evidence suggests it may have been observing us for an even more extended period. Let us start with some recently captured images of 3I Atlas that were obtained by astrophotographers in the isolated deserts of Namibia on Africa's southern extremity. This location already represents one of Earth's darkest regions, yet the photographers were able to capitalize on a lunar eclipse, during which Earth's shadow prevented any sunlight from illuminating the moon, effectively generating the most obscured sky achievable and consequently the most unobstructed view into the cosmos. Throughout this period, they could have directed their equipment toward any celestial target, yet they opted to position 3I Atlas within their frame, and what they witnessed was astonishing. The object was radiating a brilliant green luminescence against the nocturnal sky. Based on our current understanding of 3I Atlas, it should not be exhibiting this green coloration. At the very least, no natural mechanism presently exists to account for it appearing green. The dominant hypothesis among scientists and astronomers proposes that 3I Atlas is an interstellar comet. This means it shares general characteristics with all the other comets we observe traversing space. It possesses a large, luminous, diffuse envelope of gas and dust surrounding it. That constitutes the coma. Additionally, it displays a large fan-shaped tail. Yet this comet is also distinct because this particular one originated from an entirely separate star system in some distant location within the galaxy. Therefore, we anticipate it exhibiting somewhat unusual properties. However, the difficulty with 3I Atlas is that it persistently engages in behaviors that simply defy logical explanation. For instance, it is not particularly uncommon for a comet to display a green hue. Because this phenomenon is fairly standard, we possess extensive knowledge about the chemical mechanism that produces the green coloration. It occurs when carbon molecules within the coma undergo exposure to ultraviolet radiation emanating from the sun. More precisely, this affects diatomic carbon, or C2, which consists of merely two carbon atoms bonded together. Consequently, if 3I Atlas were an ordinary comet, it would contain an abundance of these carbon structures around its surface and would exhibit green coloration when exposed to sunlight. Yet we understand from observations conducted throughout the summer utilizing virtually every significant telescope in operation that 3I Atlas actually demonstrates a deficiency in these carbon chain molecules. It contains no C2. Nevertheless, it is unmistakably emitting green light. Therefore, what accounts for this occurrence? We lack an explanation. Perhaps extraterrestrial beings simply have an affinity for green illumination. Furthermore, we understand that the coma enveloping 3I Atlas is saturated with CO2, which represents carbon bonded to oxygen atoms, and that constitutes an entirely different substance from C2. It does render the object exceptionally luminous, but that would not produce green coloration. The existence of such substantial CO2 quantities alone is also quite anomalous because it dramatically exceeds the quantity of H2O or water vapor present in the coma, which essentially represents the inverse of a typical comet psi. Hence, they ordinarily contain significantly more water than CO2. However, that is not the sole peculiar element within the coma of 3I Atlas because it is also abundant in metal, specifically nickel. Once again, this is not precisely unusual for a comet, but it is peculiar for 3I Atlas to be exhibiting this behavior at this moment. Numerous comets contain metal within their composition, and frequently that metal will ultimately evaporate outward into the coma, but this exclusively occurs when the comet approaches extremely close to the sun, where sufficient heat exists to vaporize metal. 3I Atlas is not proximate to the sun, and the presence of nickel was initially detected when it remained positioned between Mars and Jupiter. Therefore, no rational explanation exists as to why it is releasing substantial quantities of metal, particularly nickel, unless one were willing to consider the hypothesis that 3I Atlas is an extraterrestrial spacecraft, in which scenario rocket propulsion systems are characteristically manufactured from metal alloys containing high nickel concentrations. When you ignite those engines, considerable nickel typically ends up within the exhaust emissions, substantial CO2 as well. Naturally, this likely is not extraterrestrial in origin. However, there is also something peculiar transpiring with the manner in which 3I Atlas is traversing the solar system, likely unconnected to rocket propulsion systems that may or may not be present. What proves intriguing is that the trajectory and velocity of 3I Atlas have remained almost flawlessly consistent throughout the entire duration we have been monitoring it. From the object's initial detection in early May through the present time in October, it has not accelerated, decelerated, or altered direction by any substantial degree. That might not appear peculiar, but if this were a comet, then it should be exhibiting considerably more movement. Comets heat up as they advance toward the sun, which causes them to melt, or more accurately to sublimate, which describes what happens when a solid transforms directly into a gaseous state. The discharge of that gas tends to propel the comet throughout space, functioning like a thruster. Consequently, a typical comet will modify velocity and direction depending on which surface is being subjected to solar radiation. We designate that movement as non-gravitational acceleration, or NGA. We characteristically measure the average distance of variation that transpires within one day. As we have observed, 3I Atlas has been performing substantial sublimation already, including a miniature tail that developed in the sun's direction, which has now started to evolve into an elongated tail that is oriented away from the sun. Nevertheless, on a daily basis, the velocity and trajectory of 3I Atlas has only varied by approximately 1.5 kilometers of NGA per day. Let us establish a comparison with 2I Borisov, the most conventional member of the interstellar trio. It was measured to vary over 100 kilometers per day, roughly 100 times more movement on average than Atlas. One possible explanation would be that Atlas is more massive and consequently more difficult to displace. That makes logical sense. However, we can introduce another comparative reference. This is Hale-Bopp. It represents one of the most massive comets we have ever identified in our solar system, at minimum as large as 3I Atlas, if not considerably more massive. We observed Hale-Bopp shifting by an average exceeding 10 kilometers of NGA per day, again, approximately 10 times more than Atlas, and Oumuamua surpasses them all dramatically. At certain points, it was altering direction by over 1,000 kilometers per day. Therefore, even when compared against other interstellar objects, 3I Atlas is moving in a remarkably peculiar manner. It is maintaining such an unusually stable trajectory that one could almost characterize it as deliberate, as though it is being navigated through the solar system. A natural explanation for that likely exists, but let us suppose that if 3I Atlas is a vessel that is being controlled, then not only can it maintain a trajectory, but it could theoretically also modify its trajectory whenever desired. Currently, we anticipate that 3I Atlas will ultimately be positioned on the opposite side of the Sun from Earth as it passes through the inner solar system. Consequently, we will not have an opportunity to observe it closely, or it will not have an opportunity to observe us unless somehow 3I Atlas is capable of decelerating itself as it passes near the Sun, and we discover it waiting for us on the opposite side. Here is an extraordinary hypothesis for your consideration that might actually possess some validity. Have you ever encountered information about the WOW signal? It was identified in 1977 by astronomers at Ohio State University who were utilizing something designated as the Big Ear Radio Telescope. It functions like a large ear that monitors for unusual phenomena in space. On this particular day, it detected something so unusual that the individual reviewing the data simply inscribed the word WOW on the paper printout, thereby generating the name. What astonished them so profoundly was this incredibly powerful narrowband radio transmission that persisted for 72 seconds and originated from a location deep in outer space. We understand that it did not originate from any of our technology. It did not originate from the Sun or any planet within our solar system. We only understand that it originated from the general direction of the constellation Sagittarius. The first element that distinguishes the WOW signal is the extraordinary amount of energy it would have necessitated to transmit a narrowband radio frequency across interstellar distances. If it was generated by extraterrestrial beings, then they would need to be a civilization so technologically advanced that they could capture the energy of a star. Alternatively, if it was a natural occurrence, then it must have been produced by some form of activity within a star. The second significant aspect about the WOW signal relates to hydrogen, which constitutes the most prevalent atom in the known universe. There exists this phenomenon called the hydrogen line. It represents a radio frequency that gets produced by hydrogen atoms. That is a considerable simplification, but all you need to comprehend is that the frequency of the hydrogen line is 1420 megahertz, and the frequency of the WOW signal, as you anticipated, 1420 megahertz. Therefore, if you were attempting to transmit a very elementary message into the galaxy in a manner that any other civilization with sophisticated understanding of science would identify, that is likely how you would accomplish it. In the 5 decades since that event, we have never detected another radio transmission that has resembled that in any way. In any case, the reason this is compelling is because astronomers have been able to reconstruct the trajectory of 3I Atlas, and we are fairly confident that it also originates from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, the identical general direction of the WOW signal. That represents a quite substantial coincidence, and it has prompted some individuals to speculate that perhaps the authentic origin of the WOW signal was not some remote star, but it might have originated from our new visitor 3I Atlas, which in the year 1977 would have been positioned on the outer periphery of our solar system, far beyond the orbit of Pluto. Perhaps it simply wanted to provide us with advance notice that it was approaching. Obviously, that is merely a hypothesis, one that has not been demonstrated to be accurate and likely never will be. However, it also has not been demonstrated to be inaccurate either. That is likely the most crucial consideration to maintain as we acquire more knowledge about 3I Atlas. Objects such as this one require that we maintain an open perspective toward the infinite possibilities of the universe. The truth exists somewhere out there, and it is advancing in our direction.